How much do you know about Antarctica? Welcome to the Everything Antarctica podcast, where your hosts Maddie Jordan and Johnny Harrison will answer all of your questions. We'll talk to globally recognised experts, discuss current affairs, news, and ultimately highlight why Antarctica should matter to you. Come on a journey as we unpack everything you've ever wondered about the world's most extreme environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. I'm your host, Maddie Jordan. I'm joined once again by my co-host, Johnny Harrison. Today, we're talking about survival training and how to stay warm in Antarctica. For me, coming from Perth, growing up in Western Australia, the cold is not something that I'd really been used to. I only saw snow for the first time when I turned 19 on a trip to the UK. So immersing myself in a super cold, a super challenging, super remote environment was something that was a bit new. I'd done a whole bunch of camping and traveling and things up until that point, but living and working in this super cold environment was something that I needed a bit of help with. So today we're going to talk about what it takes and how we get prepared for a long deployment in Antarctica. Where do we start, Johnny?
So I guess you've got a job with Antarctica, New Zealand, say you've headed south, you've made it to the ice, and usually after the first few days you're busy, and then you'll get told when you're going to go out for your survival training, and it sort of consists of two parts. So there's kind of like a classroom sort of part to it, or like an on-station part, and then the better part of it is you go out overnight somewhere else on the ice shelf, which is pretty epic. So I think we'll probably start best off in the classroom. So how does that all kick off?
Yes, I suppose it's worth noting that until you've done your survival training, you're pretty much confined to base because you don't have that experience. You don't really know how your layering system works. You don't know what the different coloured flags mean, for example. So they tend to keep you inside until you've gone through that. But there's a couple of different levels of survival training. So if you're only there for a couple of days and whatever, and you don't need to leave base, then they'll just teach you the very basics, which will give you the opportunity just to walk around the base, but you'll need to be accompanied when going out off station with other people. But the first thing really is just sitting down. It's watching a PowerPoint basically, where run through things like cold weather injuries, what to look out for. We've got different coloured flags that we mark around the base which signify different things. So for us specifically, red and green flags mark safe routes, which is probably counterintuitive to what you might think with a big red flag, but they are safe routes. Blue marks fuel and black marks danger. And then you've got different orientations of the flags. So crossed black flags means definitely don't go, or could be marking a crevasse or something similar like that. So it's all these sorts of things that you start to get a bit of an understanding of what they are. And yeah, theoretical things like that. So, you know, how to check the weather, where to find information about what's happening over the next day or the next couple of days. So if you're planning on going for a walk, where you go to find out what's happening so that you can pack adequately and things like that. And also run through the contents of a survival bag to find out, you know, what you need to take with you, and then if you do have to use it in the unlikely event that something happens, you know, how do you cook your meals, how do you start the stove, you know, what do you do with your pee, how do you use a pee bottle and all those sorts of things. So that's all the kind of stuff that comes up, and then go through the theory of it, and then you put it into practice a bit later on.
Yeah, so the other side of that as well is in the survival bags there's usually a little dome tent, and so it's kind of, you know, making sure that you can actually go and put up a tent, which is quite critical. And then there's a bunch of other sort of day-to-day sort of bits and pieces. So things like they use what they call a bothy bag, which is you sort of put one of those in the bottom of your backpack that you take around day to day, and if the wind really does pick up and you're in trouble, then you just sort of use that as another windbreak to kind of keep yourself warm until you know, if it's that bad that you've got to wait for it to die down before help arrives. So there's all those kind of things, and then they sort of talk more in detail around the layering system and kind of the different layers, and when you'd kind of be expected, or when you can expect to use the different types of layers, which is very personal dependent. And then
Definitely.
once you actually go out for the overnighter component, that's where you really put some of that stuff into practice, which is really good. And the other thing that they sort of talk to you about is the idea of this green bag situation. So having whether it's a backpack or actually having, we travel south with these physical bags which are green, which are fine, but they're more of kind of like a carry bag tote type thing. So you don't really want to be putting that on your backpack, sort of walking over to McMurdo with it. So go and sort yourself out a backpack and assign yourself one for the duration of your time down there.
The first thing I do when I get down there. The green bag just gets put in the drawers below my bed, and it doesn't see much
until travel day.
Much action until I need to go somewhere. Those backpacks that are available, just a free for all to grab that. And there's plenty of space in there for your ECW jacket, for your pee bottle, for even potentially a spare pair of shoes if you want that. Bit of snack, something to eat, a few bits and pieces of food and things like that, especially if you're going out for a reasonable period of time. Spare pairs of gloves, some extra socks even, it's quite useful, and then hand warmers, foot warmers and stuff like that. But I tend to get all of that together, and it just sits in the bag, it lives in my locker, and I know whenever I'm going outside I just grab that straight off the hook. It's got everything that I need in there. I know there's always going to be food, my pee bottle's always going to be in there, I'm going to have a change of socks or different gloves and things like that. It just makes it super efficient, super simple to get ready. Yeah,
and then even if you're just doing a quick trip over to McMurdo, you just end up grabbing that bag, sweet, away you go. You know you're set, and so anything that sort of arises, you're pretty well ready to go, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. The only thing that you will need to think about is signing out to get off base and grabbing a radio. So do you want to talk us through that process?
Yeah, so at Scott Base they've got a manual paper-based system whereby you end up going to the main comms area, and that's where the sign-out book is. So you'll go through and you'll sign out for a duration, when you expect to be back, where you're going, a contact number of your radio, so that you can end up, you've got that all assigned to you, and all of those kind of things. What else is on there?
So just the key things are, who you are, what your name is, where you're going, how you're getting there, what radio you've got, and what time you're expecting to be back. They're the kind of key things. And during the whole survival training and the learning to live in Antarctica, they run you through the process. So if you miss your sign out time, what's the process that happens after that? Typically, if you're 5 minutes late, then they'll start to ramp up a bit of a team to go, all right, where did he go? Has anyone heard from him? Does he have friends that he might be out walking with? Or, has she gone for a long duration walk, or is it just a little one? Are we expecting them back soon? Or, is it still going to be a while? Are they overnighting? And all these questions, so to start build up a bit of a picture about what's going on. The radios are great. Essentially everywhere you go, you've got radio contact back to base on a number of different radio channels. Often take a spare battery depending on the duration of time that I'm going out, and again it's like the camera batteries and the phone batteries that we spoke about, just keeping that somewhere warm in your pocket, nice and close to your body. So that's a really important part of survival, is just maintaining that communication. And
interestingly, in summer, so we end up having comms operators or dedicated people that look after sort of essentially manning the radios. And whereas in winter that's slightly different, and it's kind of the duty operator for the day, so that kind of rotates around on a rostered basis. But either which way, there's always somebody there that knows where you're going essentially, and then can in summer when they're checking the book, they'll check it quite regularly, so they'll know, oh yep, cool, I expect Johnny back at this time, cool. I haven't heard from Johnny, I haven't seen him, he hasn't come back, has he just forgotten to sign in, but he is back on base, so put a comms, put a call out over the intercom system, and kind of go from there, isn't it? Yeah, no, it's so good having that 24-hour comms in summer, because it means that you can kind of go out. I mean, it's 24 hours of sunlight, right? So there are a lot of people that will go cross-country skiing at 9 p.m, and that's totally fine because they're in constant communications with someone back on base who can,
who can manage the situation if something does eventuate. So yeah, it's a really important part of the survival training.
Yeah. So then, sort of fast forwarding on the survival training, you've signed out from base and you've gone through all that process, and you're ready for the overnight. What, or I suppose, what steps do you have to take before you're ready for the overnight? Is it getting all your sleeping kit together and all that?
Yeah. So obviously, there's quite a bit that goes into that. We are sleeping out in tents. They're called Scott Polar tents, and they're pretty similar to what the early historic explorers would have used back in the day, and they work. So we haven't really done a whole lot to change them. They're pretty efficient. So essentially, gathering a sleeping kit together, you'd take a mat to protect you from the cold. We have these nice little sheepskin rugs that sit over the top of that provide a bit of additional insulation. And then there's a sleeping bag, pillow, a few other things like that you'll want. Sometimes double sleeping bag if it's getting super cold. But a lot of the training happens in summer, so you can pretty much get away with one. And it's worth noting that you're accompanied this whole time, so you've got an outdoor expert, we call them field trainers or field support, that are there with you to guide you through the whole process. So it's not just like grab a sleeping bag and a mat and off you go and kind of work it out yourself. The whole idea is it's a training exercise, so you've got someone there who's teaching you, and you have the ability to ask questions and things like that. So
yeah, and they're always acutely aware of their responsibility to make sure that they're looking after your safety. So yeah, a lot of those sort of telltale signs for like frost nip or all those kind of, who's actually rubbing their hands together to try and keep warm, or who looks like they're just, starting to quieten down. They're usually quite a noisy or a louder person. Well, okay, maybe I need to check in on them and see how they're going.
Yeah, and it extends beyond things like that, just to making sure that people are hydrated and drinking enough. You dehydrate quite quickly in Antarctica, so making sure that you're drinking sufficient amounts of water to make sure that you're still functioning and all that sort of stuff. So these are little signs that you need to look out for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. So you've got all your kit together, you've signed out from base, and you pretty much jump in the back of a Hagland? Yeah,
typically. So a Hagland, a very effective way to get around down in Antarctica. They're sort of all-terrain tracked vehicles that do float, which is good, especially if you're driving over sea ice and things like that. But yeah, essentially pile up in the back of a Hagland and drive out to the campsite. It's essentially set up. It's probably about 6 or 7 kilometres away from base, heading out there. But on the way out, one of the things that we do need to consider is that whenever we're crossing a thing called a transition, we need to radio into base to let them know. The transition between Scott Base and the area where we go for field training, there's a transition between rock and ice shelf. So you're crossing there, and there tends to be a little bit of a crack in there, which is it's a hazardous area. It's not a crevasse, but it is an area that we like to just to make sure that people have made their way across that safely. So we'll radio in from there and say, hey, look, we're just crossing the transition. We'll let you know when we're on the other side, and then Scott Base will know, okay, cool, this is where they are. It also provides a bit of a marker to say, they're off base, they're in this area, and I know where they're heading out to. In winter, we'll call when we leave and when we arrive, but in summer, it's just, we'll check in maybe when we get there or something like that to let base know that things have gone well. So we'll get out to the camp, and sometimes there's tents already set up, but oftentimes you'll have to set your own tent up. So yeah, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so when I did field training, it was like negative 35.
Oh, yeah, that's cold.
And it was pretty windy, it was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And so we hurriedly tried to set up all these tents, and we were the first ones out for the year, so we ended up having to set all the tents up. And then the only one that might have been set up was the toilet tent, which we'll touch on shortly.
Yeah.
And once we'd sort of set all our camp up, then it was kind of, okay, cool, now we've got all our tents done, we'll move on to creating a bit of a camp kitchen. And so started using saws, cutting up some ice blocks and make a bit of a barrier wall to sort of protect ourselves from the wind, and a nice little place that we could start setting up some cookers and get ready to start making some dinner.
Yeah, people have asked about that as well. I've put up a few photos and videos of what that camp kitchen looks like, and people I think maybe under the impression that we've got like a mould or something that we pack snow into and then it pops out like an ice cube, but the snow and the compact snow there is of a consistency where you can essentially just take a saw and cut these blocks out, which works really well. So you work out into a little pit, you take these blocks away and then give them to someone else who will then stack them into typically a half, like a semicircle type thing, with a consideration of which direction the wind is blowing in to make sure that it is actually acting as a shelter and it's not just a big tunnel that's funneling the wind straight onto you. So protecting yourself from that. But it doesn't take too long to build that kitchen, maybe an hour. If you've got enough people helping you, you can get through that pretty quick.
Yeah, I'd almost the consistency of the snow is similar to that of like styrofoam or polystyrene. So you're sort of cutting through these blocks rather than very much this powdery snow, but which does make it very easy for moving big quantities of it. And it's typically quite light. I found it's not super heavy because there's very little moisture content to it. So that makes it a bit easier for sure. And definitely having big numbers to establish that camp makes it a very, very much more enjoyable process.
Yeah, you almost get a production line going, right? So you'll have someone on the saw who's cutting up blocks, and then someone else who's got a shovel or something that's prodding them out, and then that gets handed to someone, and then people just pass them along to each other, and someone's there placing it in place. And often you'll have little gaps in between, and someone will just be there stuffing it with snow and things like that. So yeah, it typically works pretty well. But when I did my field training, I think there were only 4 of us. So we built a pretty small kitchen. Obviously, given the size of the group that we had, we didn't need it to be massive. But it was also about, I don't know, maybe -4 or -6 or something. So it was a pretty good day, and we probably would have been fine getting away without it. But it was quite overcast. It wasn't sunny, so it kind of felt a little bit colder, a little bit more gloomy. But either way, it doesn't matter how many people you've got. You can get away with building a pretty sufficient kitchen or shelter.
Yeah, and that's the key essentially to that skill that you're learning in that time, is that, okay, how do I actually build a shelter rather than, if I don't have a tent and it's not easy to get it up, yep, cool, okay, what are my other options? So that's one of those skills that you learn pretty quickly. Okay, sweet, this is what the snow consistency is like, and this is how you actually physically do one of these.
Yeah, and people say, oh, why wouldn't you just build an igloo? And I mean, sometimes we do. Yeah. It is a good team building activity when you're out there, and not necessarily something that if you need to, you're going to build. You'd probably be better off just digging a hole and sleeping in that. But igloos are pretty fun. They're a cool team building experience, and it is always nice to go back to base and be like, oh, how was field training? Yeah, it was great. We built an igloo, and then people head out there and they sleep in the igloo over the next couple of days, weeks and months or whatever it might be. So not an essential part of survival training, but something fun to do anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we sort of touched on it earlier around the toilet tent. So that's one thing to note, is that we have a dedicated area that's just specifically for toilet facilities. So you sleep in your tent, but and you cook outside in the kitchen area, and then anything that you need to do in the toilet side of things, you go out to the toilet tent.
Definitely, and I think it's probably worth touching on to say that all of the human waste that's produced in the field is then sent back to Scott Base. We don't just dig holes and do our thing. All of that is contained within buckets and bottles and things like that, and then taken back to Scott Base to process. So none of it's left out there in the field, and having a tent obviously gives you a bit of privacy, but also gives you the ability to manage buckets and things like that. So yeah, I mean, the tent, it's time consuming, right, to go. You're in all these layers, you've got big gloves on and all that sort of stuff, but having a tent that's at least shelters you from the wind, if nothing else, is super helpful to go there. So often a little makeshift toilet seat with a bucket underneath it, and you do your thing, and yeah, that's about it.
Double bag, double tag.
Yep, double bag, double tag. And yeah, I mean, it's just a fabric tent, so if you're not sure whether someone's in there, you can't just knock on the door, but you would just say, hey, is anyone there? And you might get a, occupied, or, busy, or you won't get anything, and then you can make your way in. So
Yeah, and so then I guess for my field training, we ended up going up to Castle Rock after that for a bit of an evening sort of mission.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there was no rope set up or anything like that, so we couldn't scale the rock. But it was, again, sort of, you're out in the field at that point, and so a lot of those kind of markers or things to look for. So the things that we'd discussed in the classroom earlier in the day kind of start making more sense. So you start looking at the surrounds and sort of saying, oh, okay, this is where the wind's coming from, or this is where the weather is going to be baddest, or worst is going to be coming from here. And if you see it approaching from this, you've got this distance between this landmark and that landmark, so the speed that the weather's actually travelling and all those kind of things, right? Yeah,
that's a great part of survival training. It's a really interesting geological landmark, and it is elevated above much of the other landscape, so you do get a really good viewpoint. You get views out towards Mount Erebus, towards the Royal Society Range and the Transantarctic Mountains, up to Cape Evans and Cape Royds, where the early heroic explorers' huts are, which we'll touch on in future episodes. But getting a view down to the camp where you've just come from, all that sort of stuff, it just gives you a really good picture of what's happening around in the surrounding environment. And that helps to build a good picture about, I forget questions about, don't you get lost? And there's enough features around that if you know how to distinguish them and then which features are north, south, east, west, it's pretty easy to find your way around. So it's a really interesting part of that survival training, just to get your bearings and orientate yourself.
And for a lot of people, that's the first time that they've actually been properly off base since arriving down at station. So, you get off the plane and there's that kind of shock and you don't really know which way's up for a while. And then you sort of get rushed off to station, and then, okay, it's not until this time that you're like, okay, this is cool, actually starting to see some of Antarctica. It's pretty epic. Yeah,
and this is where some of those little tricks and tips with photography and stuff come in for the first time. You often find that someone gets up there and their battery's already dead, or their phone's out of juice and they're like, I really wanted to take a photo up here, and it's like, okay, cool, here's a little survival thing that we can talk about. If you're going to be using electronics, you want to keep them warm. So it's this experience that builds up over time, but you often make a lot of mistakes in that first kind of week, and you learn pretty quickly from there.
And that's where it's a safe environment to fail, right? So It's like, that's totally there. It's set up with all these people to monitor, to sort of make sure that, okay, we've got all these checks and balances there, so that nothing bad is actually going to happen. It's a very, very safe scenario and situation to be in. Yeah,
and worst case scenario, you're 10-15 minutes away from base. You feel like you're further away, but it's a pretty quick ride back if something, if someone needs some attention or something else.
Yeah. So then out for the night, go to sleep, and then wake up the next day, and what happens then?
I think before we get to that point, we'll go through what it's like to eat dinner. So this is not like you've got a chef out there who's preparing your meal like they do on base. We are typically eating backcountry meals. So they're the packets that you rip the top off, you pour some boiling water in there, and that's your dinner for the night. But to get to that point, we first need to boil some water. So how do we do that?
Yeah, so one of the things you take out into the field is camp stove. So it can be just that with a propane LPG bottle, and as long as it's not too cold, it doesn't separate, so it's pretty good. And then we also have little white spirits cookers if its temperatures are worse. So those are typically what we'd find in our survival bags. But when you're going out in a big group like this, we'll have a couple of little camp stoves that we take out there, and boil up a few pots of nice hot water, and makes for some nice hot chocolate and tea and coffee, which is always a good way to warm you up. And then, as you say, sort of pour that into your dehy and leave that sit for a few minutes while you stir it around, and then off you go. You get some sustenance back in you.
Yeah, and I suppose it's worth noting that there's a couple of ways to get water. So some people just bring out massive bottles of water, or it might just be what they've got in their drinking bottle, or we might take out a larger tub, or we can melt snow. So the first time that we did it, the field trainer said, hey, we might as well melt some snow, because we went to an area away from the camp. We known that it was relatively fresh snowfall, so we threw that in there, and obviously it takes a little bit longer to melt snow because it's colder than the water that would be in a water bottle. But that was quite a cool experience. You're melting your own snow to make water that then goes into your dehydrated meal, which provides your food for the evening. So
and that also shows you how much volume of snow that you actually need in order to create that quantity of water, right?
About a tenth, eh?
That's phenomenal, eh?
Yeah, it's quite a lot. Cool. So we've sat down. Most of the dinner will be eaten in that kitchen area, because it's a time to socialise and you get to chat. And the people that you're doing survival training with might just be someone who is down on your flight. They might not necessarily be someone that you know, or they could be from, potentially not in the same city as you in New Zealand, or potentially not even the same country. So a really cool way just to establish some friendships and make some bonds with some people. And that's really cool, because when you're back at Scott Base and you're walking down the corridor, you've at least got a couple of familiar faces, especially if it's your first time there and you don't really know many people. It's a good time to make some friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And then finally end up wrapping up for the night and call it a night.
So we'll crawl into the tent, and they're shared typically between two people. So you'll often have a roommate there with you, which sometimes is good, sometimes is not so great, especially if you've got someone who's in there that snores. But if they do snore, it's just a piece of canvas between that tent and the other tent. So often someone from a different tent that you think is miles away will complain and be like, "Who's that person snoring last night?" And it's just the nature of how it works. It's just how it goes. But you'll settle in. The key thing for me that I found was that I need to go to bed warm. So I need to make sure that my toes aren't even remotely cold before I jump into the sleeping bag. My fingertips are all good. And yeah, that makes a massive difference. So often just running around or going for a little walk just to warm yourself up, and then jumping into your sleeping bag immediately after that. One of the benefits that we get with the dehydrated meals is that we're boiling up large portions of water, which are really great to pour into your water bottles and then slip in your sleeping bag to keep yourself warm. So I often had I guess it's a hot water bottle, right? It's a hot water bottle. Had a hot water bottle down by my toes to keep my toes warm, and it just makes for a nice night's sleep.
One of the things that I've found quite interesting about that whole field training and survival training experience is the idea that actually you're okay if you're cold, and that understanding where, okay, it's now I'm not okay being cold. And for a lot of people, you're never exposed to that level of needing to understand that difference and that distinction between when it's okay to be cold and when it's not okay to be cold. Yeah. And so I think that was one of the key lessons that I brought out, is like, yep, okay, sweet, I can be uncomfortable and cold and be perfectly fine and safe, and I'm not going to get hypothermia, I'm not going to get frostbite, but then understanding where that line is, and when it's like, okay, now it's okay, I've been cold for a long time, or I'm cold getting colder, and I'm not maintaining the level that I had. That's when it's starting to get dangerous.
Yeah, that's when you start speaking to people and you say, look, I'm actually getting cold. What can we do about it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Cool. So you wake up the next day, often there's frost above your head from your breath that's frozen overnight. You'll occasionally get icicles from the top of the tent sort of hanging down that are growing as the time goes on. So that's always pretty interesting. But what happens the next day once you've woken up?
Yeah, so everyone slowly sort of gets up and out of bed, and takes a wee while to sort of get going, particularly when you're a bit colder. And then, everyone sort of emerges from their tents and comes and has breakfast. And for me, it was I couldn't really be bothered waiting for all the water to boil, so I thought, I'll be smart here and I'll just grab a granola bar and just have this granola bar. And so I went and chucked it in my mouth, and then
it's instantly frozen.
And it was already frozen, and it had been frozen well all night. And I was like, okay. So then reach into my jackets and put it up underneath my armpit and just leave it there for about 20 minutes while it's like, and then by that time everyone's got their boiling water in there, they've got their nice warm porridge, and I'm like, maybe that wasn't the smartest decision.
Anyway, I pretty much did the same thing, because we typically get back to base by about 10 a.m, which is just in time for smoko or morning tea. So I often just left it. I would do the same. I might be able to steal a bit of hot water from someone to have a cup of tea or something in the morning, but I often didn't eat much out there for that reason exactly, as it was often a granola bar or something like that, and it was frozen by the time you tried to eat it. So anyway, just wait to get back to base and eat nice warm food with everyone else.
So then you pack up all your sleeping bag and everything like that, and load everything back up in the Hagland, and then head back to base.
Yeah, back to base. Typically you'll probably have a meal, and then after that it's all about decanting. So you're washing your sleeping bag and getting that all ready so that it's all set up for the next group that goes out. So
yeah, we call it demobilising at the end. So demob, typically anytime you've got any kind of field event or going out anywhere, there's always kind of a breakup of activities, and this person looks after that thing or whatever. Particularly if you've got a bigger group, it's quite good to be able to smash that out pretty quick and kind of return back to do a bit of a recap, and then you've sort of been signed off on your field training skills, and off you go. You're free.
Yeah, that recap's really cool, because you get to go through the learnings and what went well, what didn't go so well, what could we have done better, what would have made your experience better, which is not only helpful for you in the group to learn, but it's also taken by that field trainer to employ to the next group that goes out and say, hey, the last group learnt this, maybe it's something that you might want to think about doing. So always a process of continual learning, and always trying to get better, always seeking feedback on things that go well and things that don't go well, so that we can learn from them and do better next time.
Yeah, so good. So I guess it's one thing to note is that whenever you are travelling in aircraft or anything like that, you'll always have survival bags, but you'll also be in your full ECW. Whenever you're travelling in a vehicle or any sort of mode of transportation, there'll always be a survival bag there. So the contents that you learn to use on your survival survival training, they're everywhere.
Yeah, it's
so
relevant.
it's one of those things that it's not just a kind of, oh yeah, that was a nice to do and away you go. It's kind of like, okay, are we going out in the field? Right, let's go and get ourselves a survival bag, chuck it on the top of the Hagland, and out we go. So it's very forefront in your mind when you're thinking about how remote you are. It just has to come into your every decision making.
Pretty much, and it becomes second nature after a while, right? You're just like, oh cool, we're going out, grab your grain bag, grab your survival bag, and everything's all good.
Yep.
You're comfortable knowing that you know how to use it if you need to. So yeah, it's great training.
Yeah, so good.
It also helps that it's heaps of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not many people that get to spend a night out in the middle of nowhere in Antarctica. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And the other one is, how many of those skills do you actually apply now when you're not on the ice, right? Like
Heaps.
just that readiness mindset and that kind of, thinking about a few steps ahead.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, even if I'm going up into the mountains or something in New Zealand, if I'm going snowboarding or whatever, I'll think about the layering system and be like, all right, cool, have I got my thermals, have I got my gloves, have I got spare socks and all that sort of stuff, and it just comes with me. It's just second nature now. Yeah. That's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to find out more about us as hosts, you can find us on Instagram at Matty K. Jordan and at Johnny Harrison NZ. We're also on socials. You can find us at Everything Antarctica. This episode will be released on all streaming platforms and the long form video will be found on YouTube. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. This will really help us in our mission to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. Please share this episode with your friends and social networks so we can spread the word to more people.
Until next time, stay cool.